Okay, so in this video I want to talk about what is one of the more controversial subjects in the headphone world, the topic of burn-in and whether or not it is real. So what is burn-in? Well, you actually can't touch this subject online without people debating it hotly on both sides. Most of the reviewers are like people who are writing publications for websites, even on forums who are writing reviews, will advocate for a process of burning in your headphone, which is essentially you just run it with either various tracks or even white noise for a certain period of time, usually like 8 to 12 hours. And this is supposed to allow the headphone to sufficiently open up and reveal its true potential and true nature, rather than if you just, listen to it straight out of the box. And on the other side, if you don't believe in burn-in, you typically see this process as something that damages the credibility of the publication, because it's, in your mind, it's not really a real thing, or it's just a waste of time. To be clear, psychological burn-in or brain burn-in is definitely real. It's just a matter of degrees, and often the term psychological burn-in is a way to kind of bridge the gap between people who advocate for burn-in being real and those who say that this is all just nonsense, because this is a way for the latter category to say, well, what you're hearing might sound like it's a difference in what the drivers are doing, but it's actually just your brain getting used to the tonality and the sound signature. So when I'm talking about burn-in here in this video, I want to just kind of leave that psychological stuff to one side and really hone in more on the question of the process of burning in a headphone, so that you ensure that all the drivers and all the materials in the driver are giving you the optimal results that'll allow your headphone to perform at its best, essentially, when you evaluate it. On the one hand, there are, on the side that say burn-in is not real, or that it's only psychological burn-in, people have done measurements between different headphones, one that's been burned in and one that hasn't, to try and test whether or not there's a difference. And the results have been largely inconclusive. So the prevailing wisdom on this is that whatever differences there are in the measurements, because they do show differences, they're not sufficient to account for the drastic differences that people are reporting when they report the differences in burn-in versus not burned in. In many cases, the differences that exist when in the measurements, so again, frequency response measurements, or you can do like decay graphs and charts and stuff like that, that's within the margin of error for the equipment itself. So you're not necessarily getting a conclusive answer on measurements. But the reality of measurements is that you can't do a proper evaluation of what a headphone's going to sound like completely just by looking at measurements. Unfortunately, it's a good indicator. It's a predictor of what kind of sound you might get. It's not going to tell you the truth of what the headphone's going to sound like. It's just going to be an indicator. On the pro burn-in side, you have to look at the manufacturing process for headphones, and in almost every case, there's a step, or there's a line for quality assurance that includes at some point a burn-in like process. Now, whether that's called burn-in or something else is totally up to the manufacturer. Sometimes they don't call it that. And then there's also usually a driver matching stage, where they want to ensure that the drivers are perfectly paired with one another so you don't get channel imbalance. And this is, again, something that involves playing tones through those headphones. The process involves the same kind of thing, where the drivers and the materials are being used just to make sure that it passes the quality assurance or quality control checks. So it's happening to some degree on the manufacturing side. And what burn-in advocates are going to say, or many of these people who are writing these publications, is that sometimes on the manufacturing side, it doesn't get the burn-in, or whatever that process is called, to a sufficient degree that's going to properly reveal the headphone's unique qualities to you. So when you're evaluating the headphone, you have to do this yourself, and you have to wait the extra 8 to however many hours of just playing whatever white noise or music in the background in order to properly test what it sounds like, because you're not going to get that based just on what the manufacturer has done. Or if a particular unit has gone through the manufacturing process without sufficiently having that burn-in done, you want to ensure that you remove that variable from the equation. So a headphone could sound totally different after 8 hours if it hasn't had any burn-in done, because for whatever reason it just didn't go through that quality assurance process. And this allows you to kind of just take that out of take that inconsistency out. So as far as the process that's involved in evaluating a headphone with or without burn-in, it's a pragmatic choice to do the burn-in. So when I read that this person's credibility is completely ruined or tarnished because they wrote a publication that talked about doing burn-in for these headphones, I think that's actually kind of crazy, because for the same reason that people will listen to 24-bit FLAC files, either there's such a little difference that they can't hear it at all, or there literally is no difference. It's just a matter of prudence, because you want to make sure that that's not a limiting factor in your chain, right? You want to make sure that you're getting the highest quality files, and then you can build your system out from there, right? You don't want your DAC to be a limiting factor. You don't want your amp to limit it, and you don't want your headphones to limit it. Similarly, you don't want the potential lack of this process in quality assurance to affect whether or not you actually hear the headphone at its best. And the people on the other side, on the no burn-in side, are still going to say, well, that's just still nonsense. And to me, even if you think that it's nonsense, even if that's what your experience of headphones has led you to believe, it's still a prudent thing to do. It's still a pragmatic way to evaluate a headphone, because it's basically like saying, I don't know whether or not burn-in is real, but at the very least, I want to eliminate that as a factor when I'm evaluating it. So this idea of it all of a sudden ruining the credibility of the reviewer or of the publication, in my mind is just nuts. Like, you would want to do whatever you can possibly do to make sure that you're getting the most out of that piece of equipment. And then on the pro side, all it takes is one example of going to a store, listening to a demo unit headphone or IEM or whatever, and then buying that same product, taking it out of the box in the store and listening to it and comparing it to what you just heard for the demo unit. And I get that pads and pad wear and even wear on tips can have an impact. But if you then swap the pads out to the brand new pads or brand new tips, that should still give you an indication of whether or not burn-in is required. And in most cases, I think it probably isn't. In like 90-something%, actually I'm just throwing that number out there, but in the majority of headphones, you probably don't need to do any burn-in. I think, and even the ones where they advocate doing it, I think it's probably not necessary. But all it takes is one time for, when you're doing that kind of comparison in a store, or say you have your friend's headphone that you've used that he's used for a while, or she's used for a while, and you compare the brand new one of the same thing that you just bought, do that test and see what the results are. And even if in the majority of cases there's no difference, if there's one time where there is a difference, that's an indicator that you should be doing this burn-in process. So the reason I have both of these headphones out is to explain what that process was like for these. This is the Campfire Andromeda on the left and the One More Triple Driver on the right. With the Campfire Andromeda, there was a difference in the in-store unit and the unit that I purchased. It wasn't huge, the difference, but it was there. And it wasn't, I checked with the different tips as well. So it wasn't that. And then I went back a day later just for a different reason, and I checked again. And I couldn't hear that same difference. So that's an anecdotal experiential claim about this headphone or this IEM being different after using it for a little bit versus the unit that had been used for a long time than it was fresh out of the box. But in my opinion, it wasn't enough of a difference for me to say this is properly evidence of burn-in being a requirement for every headphone. And certainly even for these ones, right? They sounded even out of the box pretty damn good. But the interesting one in my mind is this one more triple driver, because the story behind this is I just walked into this store and was like, hey, I need a headphone or IEM, because I just didn't have one at the time. And the guy, he said, oh, try these out. They're brand new. And this was like about a year ago. See what you think. Tried them on, and instantly I was just wowed. I was like, oh, perfect, great. I'll pick them up. I bought them, just took them out in the store, tried them on, and I was like, what the hell? This doesn't even sound anything like the demo unit, even though they had the same tips and everything. I then tried using them for like better part of a week and did the same thing and came back and went, wow, okay, they definitely needed to be burned in. So again, this is anecdotal, experiential stuff. Not everybody's had this experience, but all it took was one example for me to say, yeah, this really needed it. And so if you want to do this test yourself, I recommend going to a store and buying 2 of these and opening one and using it for a month. I'm not saying you need to use to burn it in that long. I'm just saying to make sure this test is done well, and then open up the other one and compare it and see how different they sound. And I think you'll be surprised with the results. But I just want to be clear here that I'm not saying that burn-in is going to be universally real. I think the takeaway or the bottom line for this topic of discussion is somewhat of a nuanced middle ground between no burn-in and burn-in for everything. Because in the majority of cases, you don't need to burn in a headphone, and it won't make any difference whatsoever. Most of the Sennheiser stuff, for example, they have a process nailed down there for mass production that makes it so you really don't need to do that. Or if you did try that, you wouldn't really hear a difference. But there are going to be some cases where, and not just on a headphone-to-headphone basis, but on a unit-to-unit basis, where whatever has happened in the production cycle just hasn't accounted for properly for what's required to make them all sound the same. So whether that's a quality assurance thing, or it's just that it wasn't used, it wasn't turned on for long enough, because certainly they don't do it for everything at the same level, right? I mean, there's going to be flaws in the production cycle no matter what. So the nuanced position that I'm trying to communicate here, or the bottom line that I want to leave you with, is, for starters, the process of doing burn-in for headphones when evaluating them is not something that should indicate that somebody's credibility is a dumpster fire. You know, whether you believe in it or not, it's just a prudent thing to do. The second takeaway is that burn-in probably isn't necessary for the majority of headphones. It's probably already done, or whatever differences you might account for with burn-in is very likely to not be a factor when you're actually listening to the headphones, even when you buy it straight out of the box. So when people tell you you need to do this amount of burn-in, that's probably not true. And then the third thing is that all it takes is one time for you to hear a difference, properly tested difference, between a unit that's been used for a long time and a unit that is brand new, to be able to understand that there is something there that indicates a difference in the sound that'll change over time, that isn't just psychological or brain burn-in. So I hope that makes it clear. And I hope that doesn't put me in one camp or the other, because I'm really trying not to say burn-in isn't real or that burn-in is absolutely real, because I think the truth of this, and this is what all the evidence and all the measurements and all the indicators are pointing to, whether or not it's true, is that middle ground, that burn-in is probably not necessary even if it's real. That's where the truth of this lies. If there's a reason not to, like say there's measurements that have come out that actually show that burn-in is absolutely real, or that is necessary for every headphone, I'm happy to be proven wrong. I don't want to be wrong any longer than I need to be. Conversely, on the other side, if there's a prevailing wisdom that I'm not aware of that say that burn-in is absolutely not necessary, and there's something else that accounts for the difference in doing this test of a brand new unit versus a unit that's been used for a long time, then I'm happy to incorporate that and do those tests myself, because again, for the same reason, I don't want to be wrong any longer than I need to be. But I hope that is food for thought in the what is somewhat of a radioactive topic when it comes to headphones, and hopefully that doesn't put me in one camp or the other, because I really feel that it is somewhat of a middle ground, or the truth is somewhere in between. Okay, until next time.